you are not a royal guard. You steal this dress, yes? Maybe
No.
you are here so you can take money from us tourists.
I'm a real royal guard. Step back,
No,
man.
you are a liar, and I will not...
Oi!
July 15th, 2023. Margaret Whitmore had spent 30 years running from Belfast. The one place she swore she'd never return to was standing right in front of Buckingham Palace. Royal Guard Sergeant Thomas McKenna didn't flinch when she started screaming, didn't move when she shoved his chest, didn't break when she called him a mindless toy soldier while 50 tourists filmed. What happened in the next 90 seconds would destroy her law practice, end her relationship with her daughter, and finally settle a debt that began with blood on Cromwell Street. The video went viral in 6 hours. The truth took 30 years, because sometimes the past doesn't just catch up with you. Sometimes it puts on a uniform and waits. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's Louboutin heels clicked against the pavement with military precision as she stepped closer to the motionless guard. Behind his bearskin cap and scarlet tunic, she caught something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition that made her stomach clench with the same sick dread she'd felt fleeing Belfast in 1993. "Mum, please stop." Sarah's voice carried the familiar note of mortification that had defined their relationship since the divorce. "You're making a scene." But Margaret couldn't stop. Something about this guard's unwavering stare had triggered every defense mechanism she'd built over 3 decades of courtroom battles. The way he held himself, the slight tilt of his chin, the absolute stillness that reminded her of another young man in uniform, bleeding out on wet cobblestones while she ran. "I said move," she hissed at the guard, her voice dropping to the lethal whisper that had made opposing counsel tremble. "I know your type, following orders without thinking, just like..." The words died in her throat. Just like the boy soldiers in Belfast, just like the ones she'd left behind. Thomas McKenna's expression remained carved from stone, but his knuckles had gone white around his rifle. For 30 years he'd imagined this moment, planned it, dreamed of the day Margaret Whitmore would stand before him, not recognizing the 6-year-old boy who'd watched his sister die because a British intelligence officer chose her career over keeping her promises. The tourists kept filming. A teenage girl with her phone held high giggled to her friend, "She's totally mental." An elderly American couple exchanged worried glances. A businessman in an expensive suit shook his head at Margaret's performance. None of them understood they were witnessing the final act of a tragedy that began with a scared intelligence officer and a little girl's broken trust. Margaret's breathing had quickened. The London heat felt suffocating, pressing against her like the walls of that Belfast safe house where she'd made the choice that haunted her dreams. She could smell the Thames mixing with car exhaust, but her mind conjured different scents: gunpowder, fear, and the metallic tang of blood on rain-soaked streets. "Margaret, what's wrong with you?" Sarah grabbed her mother's arm, her medical training kicking in as she noticed the tremor in Margaret's hands. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She had. Standing 6 feet away in the uniform of the Crown, Thomas McKenna was every ghost from Belfast, wrapped in scarlet wool and unwavering duty. The little boy who'd begged her not to leave, the teenager who'd identified his sister's body, the young recruit who'd enlisted the day after the funeral, carrying a hatred as precise as his marksmanship. Margaret's voice cracked as she took another step forward. "I know you can hear me. I know you're not just some mindless..." "Ma'am?" Thomas's voice cut through her tirade like a blade. Soft, controlled, with the faintest trace of a Belfast accent that made Margaret's blood freeze. "Please step back." The crowd had grown larger. More phones appeared. Someone whispered about calling security. But Thomas remained perfectly still, his gaze locked on the woman who'd destroyed his family with her cowardice. He'd spent 3 decades climbing through military ranks, accepting this prestigious posting, waiting for the intelligence reports that would tell him when Margaret Whitmore planned to visit London with her daughter. He'd requested this exact shift, this exact position, knowing her tour group would pass this way at precisely 2:47 p.m. Margaret stumbled backward, her heel catching on uneven pavement. Sarah steadied her, but nothing could steady the revelation crashing through Margaret's mind. That voice, those eyes, the deliberate way he'd said her name without her ever introducing herself. "Oh God," she whispered. "Tommy?" The name hung in the air between them like a gun waiting to fire. Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that behind his professional facade, The boy who'd lost everything was screaming for justice. The viral video would show Margaret's face crumbling with recognition. It would capture the moment she realized her past hadn't just found her. It had been hunting her with the patience of someone who'd learned to kill for queen and country. What the cameras couldn't capture was Thomas's voice, pitched so low that only Margaret could hear. "You left us to die, Ms. Whitmore. Now it's your turn." Sarah was pulling at her mother's arm, confused and frightened by the sudden shift in Margaret's demeanor. The tourists sensed something darker unfolding but kept filming anyway, their phones documenting the beginning of Margaret's public destruction. Margaret's mouth moved soundlessly as she backed away from the guard who'd grown up to become her reckoning. Her Hermes bag slipped from her trembling fingers, contents scattering across the pavement, lipstick, phone, and a small silver cross she'd carried since Belfast. Thomas watched the cross roll toward his polished boots, but didn't move to stop it. He'd spent 30 years learning patience from the best military instructors in the world. The hunt was just beginning. Time seemed suspended in the golden afternoon light filtering through London's haze. Margaret stared at the silver cross lying between Thomas's boots, its familiar weight absent from her palm for the first time in 3 decades. The delicate chain had snapped when her bag fell, leaving the tiny crucifix orphaned on the ancient stones where countless pilgrims and tourists had walked before. Sarah's voice seemed to come from underwater. "Mom? Mom, what's happening?" Margaret could feel her daughter's medical training kicking in, the way Sarah's fingers found her pulse point, the clinical assessment in her touch. It was the same gentle precision Sarah had inherited from her father, the same careful attention to detail that had made her an exceptional surgeon at 32. Everything Margaret had worked to protect, everything she'd built her life around, stood there in a navy dress and sensible shoes, trying to understand why her formidable mother had crumbled before a silent guard. "I'm fine," Margaret whispered. But the words felt like ash. Nothing about this moment was fine. The tourists continued their casual documentation, phones held high like offerings to some digital god of viral entertainment. They saw a well-dressed woman having what appeared to be a breakdown. They couldn't see the 19-year-old intelligence officer who'd once promised a 6-year-old boy that she'd keep his sister safe. Thomas's presence loomed before her, solid and immovable as the palace walls behind him. 30 years had carved the softness from his face, replacing boyish features with the sharp angles of someone who'd learned to carry death as professionally as he carried his rifle. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes that had once looked at her with desperate trust, remained unchanged. They held the same clarity, the same terrible honesty that had haunted her dreams. The London crowds flowed around them like water around stones, oblivious to the reckoning unfolding in their midst. Margaret caught fragments of conversation, American accents discussing lunch plans, teenagers debating which guard looked more attractive, a guide explaining the history of the changing of the guard to a group of Japanese tourists. Normal people living normal lives, untouched by the weight of choices made in Belfast's shadow 30 years ago. Sarah crouched to gather the scattered contents of Margaret's bag, her movements efficient and careful. She'd always been the steady one, even as a child navigating her parents' increasingly bitter marriage. While Margaret had thrown herself into cases that bled into 18-hour days and sleepless nights, Sarah had quietly excelled at everything: school, university, medical training, as if her very competence could somehow balance her mother's relentless drive. "Here," Sarah said softly, holding out the silver cross. "You dropped this." Margaret's fingers trembled as she took it. The metal felt cold despite the afternoon warmth, and she could see her own reflection distorted in its polished surface. How many times had she clutched this cross during the darkest moments of her career? How many nights had she pressed it between her palms while praying for forgiveness that never came? "It was your grandmother's," Margaret said, though she'd never told Sarah the real reason she carried it. Not about Belfast, not about the promises broken or the lives lost, not about the little girl who'd worn a matching cross the night Margaret chose to save herself instead. Thomas hadn't moved. His training demanded absolute stillness during his duty hours, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight adjustment of his grip on his rifle. He was waiting, patient as a hunter who'd spent 3 decades tracking his prey. The afternoon light caught the gold threads in his uniform, the polished buttons that reflected the palace windows behind him. He looked magnificent in the way only the royal guards could, a living symbol of British tradition and honor. No one watching would guess that beneath the ceremonial splendor stood a man driven by a grief so pure it had shaped every choice he'd made since childhood. Margaret's throat felt raw. "Sarah, we should go." But even as she said it, she knew running was impossible. Not again. Not after 30 years of building walls around the truth, of burying Belfast beneath layers of professional success and carefully constructed distance from anything that mattered too much. Thomas had found her here, in the heart of London, surrounded by tourists and cameras and the very symbols of the crown she'd once served. This wasn't coincidence. This was justice, patient and precise. Sarah's hand found her elbow, steadying and warm. "Whatever's wrong, we can talk about it. You know that, right?" Margaret looked at her daughter, brilliant, compassionate Sarah, who believed problems could be solved with enough skill and care, and felt her heart break a little more. In a few hours, maybe less, Sarah would know exactly what kind of woman had raised her, what kind of choices her mother had made in the dark. The viral video was already uploading to servers across the globe, carrying Margaret's recognition and Thomas's silent promise to millions of strangers who thought they were watching simple entertainment. Margaret tucked the cross into her jacket pocket and stood straighter. If Thomas wanted his reckoning, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her crawl. But God help them both, she finally understood that some debts could never be forgiven, only paid in full. Margaret's phone buzzed against her ribs with the insistent rhythm of someone who wouldn't be ignored. The sound cut through the fog of recognition that had settled over her like Belfast rain, sharp and immediate in a way that made her flinch. Sarah was guiding her away from Thomas, away from the cameras still tracking their movement, but Margaret's legs felt disconnected from her body, wooden and unreliable. "Answer it," Sarah murmured, her surgeon's instincts recognizing crisis management when she saw it. "Whatever just happened, you need to—" The phone buzzed again. Margaret pulled it from her jacket with trembling fingers, the silver cross shifting against her knuckles like a weight she could never quite balance. The number on the screen made her stomach plummet into freefall, her law firm's senior partner calling on a Saturday afternoon from New York. She almost declined the call, almost let it ring through to voicemail where she could control the timing, craft a response, maintain the professional distance that had kept her alive through 3 decades of legal warfare. But something in Thomas's stillness behind her, the patient way he'd resumed his post as if nothing had changed, told her that waiting was no longer an option. "Richard." Her voice sounded steadier than it had any right to. "Margaret, thank Christ you picked up." Richard Chen's accent carried the sharp edge of someone who'd been fielding calls for the past hour. "Where exactly are you right now?" "London. With Sarah. What's—" "I need you to listen very carefully. There's a video. It's everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, every goddamn platform on the internet. And it's you, Margaret, having some kind of breakdown in front of Buckingham Palace." The pavement beneath Margaret's feet seemed to shift. Sarah was watching her with growing concern, medical training warring with daughterly worry in her expression. Behind them, the crowds continued their cheerful documentation of royal London, oblivious to the fact that they were witnessing the systematic destruction of everything Margaret had built. "How bad?" Margaret's voice had dropped to the whisper she used in courtrooms when she was about to deliver a killing blow. "Bad enough that I've had 3 major clients call asking if their divorce attorney has lost her mind. Bad enough that Karen vs. Royal Guard is trending #2 globally. Bad enough that CNN wants a comment within the hour." Margaret closed her eyes, but that only made it worse. She could see Thomas's face behind her eyelids, not as he was now, a man shaped by military discipline and patient revenge, but as he'd been that night in Belfast, 6 years old, clutching his sister's hand while bullets shattered windows around them. The same clear blue eyes that had trusted her completely when she'd promised to come back for them. "The video," she managed. "Does it show? Can you hear what was said?" "That's the thing, Margaret. The audio is shit. Traffic noise, wind, tourists talking. But your face, Christ, your face when you see this guard, you look like you've seen the devil himself." If only it were that simple. The devil she could have faced with her usual arsenal of legal precision and cold fury. But Thomas McKenna wasn't evil. He was something far more dangerous. He was justice delayed, served at precisely the temperature of revenge. Sarah touched her arm. "Mom, what video?" Margaret pulled the phone away from her ear for a moment, meeting her daughter's concerned gaze. How could she explain that the mother Sarah knew, successful, controlled, unshakable, was built on a foundation of cowardice? That every case Margaret had won, every client she'd saved, every professional triumph had been an attempt to balance scales that could never be made right? "Richard, I need you to do something for me, Margaret said into the phone, her legal mind finally engaging despite the chaos. Pull my personnel files from the intelligence service. Everything from 1991 to 1993. Margaret, what the hell does this have to do with Belfast? The word came out like a confession. Pull everything related to my posting in Belfast. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Margaret to wonder if the call had dropped. When Richard spoke again, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who just realized his partner had been hiding something dangerous. How much of your past are we talking about here, Margaret? Because if this video is connected to something from your intelligence days, we need to get ahead of it before the line went dead. Margaret stared at her phone's blank screen, then slowly looked up to find Sarah watching her with an expression she'd never seen before. Professional assessment mixed with personal betrayal. Intelligence service? Sarah's voice was barely audible above the London traffic. You told me you worked in government administration before law school. Margaret felt the last of her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. 30 years of lies, half-truths, and protective silences were about to collapse under the weight of one viral video and a royal guard's patient revenge. The past hadn't just returned, it had been hunting her all along. The Starbucks on Victoria Street felt like sanctuary, until Margaret realized sanctuary was an illusion she could no longer afford. Sarah had insisted they needed somewhere private to talk, somewhere away from the endless stream of tourists and their cameras, but privacy was a luxury that had died the moment that video started uploading. Margaret's hands wrapped around her untouched coffee, the ceramic mug cold despite the steam rising from its surface. Across from her, Sarah sat with the careful stillness of a surgeon preparing for a difficult operation, that particular quality of focused attention she'd inherited from her father, not from Margaret's side of the family where chaos and quick thinking were the inherited traits. Government administration, Sarah said quietly. Her voice held no accusation, only the careful neutrality she used with patients delivering incomplete medical histories. That's what you told me when I was 10, and asked why you never talked about your work before law school. Margaret's phone lay face down on the small table between them, but she could feel it vibrating with incoming messages. Text alerts, email notifications, missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize. The digital world was consuming her in real time, chewing through 30 years of carefully maintained privacy with the efficiency of a wood chipper. I wanted to protect you, Margaret said, the words feeling inadequate even as they left her mouth. What I did before, it wasn't something a child needed to know about. I'm not a child anymore. Sarah's fingers drummed once against her own cup, a nervous tell Margaret recognized from family dinners that had gone sideways, from conversations about Margaret's divorce that had revealed more than anyone intended. Intelligence service means what, exactly? MI5? MI6? Something else entirely? The question hung between them like a blade waiting to fall. Margaret found herself studying her daughter's face, looking for signs of the girl who'd once believed her mother could fix anything with enough determination and sharp words. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that some problems couldn't be solved with good intentions and careful technique. Does it matter? Margaret deflected, but even she could hear the weakness in her voice. It was 30 years ago, a different life. It matters because a man in a Royal Guard uniform just made you fall apart in front of half the internet. Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to the whisper she probably used in hospital corridors when delivering difficult news. It matters because you've been lying to me my entire life about who you were before you became my mother. Margaret's phone vibrated again, more insistently this time. Through the coffee shop's window, she could see the normal flow of London life. Office workers heading home early, tourists consulting maps, teenagers clustered around bus stops with their phones held high. None of them knew that somewhere in their digital feeds, a video was spreading that would destroy everything she'd built. The guard, Sarah continued. You knew him. I saw your face, Mum. You looked like you'd seen a ghost. Margaret's voice cracked. His name is Thomas McKenna. He was 6 years old when I knew him. The admission felt like swallowing glass. Sarah's expression shifted from frustrated concern to something approaching professional assessment, the way she might evaluate a patient presenting with symptoms that suggested a diagnosis worse than anyone wanted to consider. 6 years old, in Belfast, during your intelligence posting, Sarah's words came slowly, carefully, like someone feeling her way across unstable ground. What happened to him? Margaret's fingers found the cross in her jacket pocket, its familiar weight both comfort and condemnation. She'd carried it through depositions that destroyed marriages, through court battles that ruined lives, through sleepless nights when the guilt became too heavy to bear alone. But she'd never carried it into this conversation, the one she'd spent 30 years avoiding. "His sister died," Margaret whispered. "Bridget McKenna. She was 8 years old, and she died because I—" The words stuck in her throat like shards of the past refusing to be spoken. "Because I made a choice." The coffee shop around them continued its normal rhythm. Espresso machines hissing, customers chatting, baristas calling out orders in voices bright with practiced cheer. But at their small table, time had stopped. Sarah sat frozen, her surgeon's composure finally cracking as the implications of Margaret's confession settled over her. Margaret's phone buzzed again. This time, she turned it over. Missed calls, 23. Text messages, 47. Email notifications, 156. The number was growing in real time. Each alert another fracture in the wall she'd built between her past and present. Somewhere in those messages were journalists seeking comment, colleagues demanding explanations, strangers who'd seen the video and wanted their piece of the viral moment that was destroying her life. But none of them knew what Thomas knew. None of them understood that this wasn't random internet drama. This was 30 years of patient planning, finally bearing fruit. "Mom," Sarah's voice was barely audible. "What did you do?" Margaret looked at her daughter, brilliant, compassionate Sarah who still believed the world could be made right with enough skill and care, and realized that some truths were too heavy to carry alone. The reckoning had begun, waiting to fall and shatter what remained of Sarah's faith in the woman who'd raised her. Margaret's throat felt raw, as if she'd been screaming, though she'd barely spoken above a whisper. Around them, the Starbucks hummed with ordinary Saturday afternoon energy. Students hunched over laptops, mothers corralling children sticky with Frappuccino foam, the eternal London soundtrack of traffic and construction bleeding through plate glass windows. But their corner table had become an island of reckoning, cut off from the normal world by 30 years of buried truth, finally clawing its way to the surface. "The choice," Sarah said carefully, her surgeon's training evident in the way she approached the wound. "Tell me about the choice." Margaret's phone lit up again, a call from a number she didn't recognize, followed immediately by another. The viral machine was feeding now, consuming her privacy in real time, but that felt almost manageable compared to the devastation in her daughter's eyes. She declined both calls without looking. 1993, Margaret began, her voice hollow. "I was 28, posted to Belfast as an intelligence liaison. My job was to monitor IRA safe houses, track weapons movements, identify targets for special branch raids." The words tasted like copper pennies. The McKenna family lived on Cromwell Street, Catholic neighborhood, very Republican, very dangerous for someone like me. Sarah's coffee sat untouched, growing cold as she processed information that reframed everything she'd believed about her mother's past. "Someone like you?" A British intelligence officer, a Protestant girl from Surrey who'd learned enough Ulster accent to pass in the dark. Margaret's laugh held no humor. "I was supposed to be invisible, but Thomas and Bridget, they saw me. Children notice things adults miss. I was the lady who walked past their house every Tuesday and Friday at 6:30, always carrying the same blue umbrella, always wearing that silver cross." The cross felt heavy in her pocket now, weighted with the memory of small fingers reaching for it in the dark. Bridget had been fascinated by its shine, had asked once if angels wore jewelry. Margaret had told her yes, angels wore crosses, so they could find their way home. "They started following me," Margaret continued. "Just a few steps at first, then whole blocks." Thomas was protective of his sister. Their parents worked nights at the docks, left the children with neighbors who drank too much and paid too little attention. I should have reported it, should have changed my route, my timing, my entire operational pattern, but you didn't. Sarah's statement carried no judgment, only the terrible clarity of someone beginning to understand. "No, I didn't." Margaret's phone buzzed again, a text this time, preview showing just enough words to make her stomach clench. "BBC News request, comment on viral video. Because they were lonely and I was lonely, and for 20 minutes every Tuesday and Friday, I got to pretend I was just Margaret, not Agent Whitmore, not someone whose job was cataloging violence for bureaucrats who'd never heard a bomb go off. The coffee shop's familiar sounds, grinding beans, steaming milk, credit card machines beeping, seemed to fade into white noise. Margaret was back on Cromwell Street, feeling autumn rain through her blue umbrella, watching Bridget skip over puddles while Thomas walked beside her with the careful seriousness of a boy forced to grow up too fast. "They trusted me," Margaret whispered, "called me their secret angel. Bridget said I must be sent from heaven because I always appeared when they needed someone to walk with them. And I, God forgive me, I let them believe it." Sarah's breathing had changed, becoming shallow and controlled in the way Margaret recognized from childhood asthma attacks. But this wasn't medical crisis. This was the slow suffocation of discovering that your entire understanding of someone was built on lies. What happened that night? Sarah's voice was barely audible. Margaret's phone erupted with another series of notifications. Someone had tagged her law firm's Twitter account. Someone else had found her professional headshot and paired it with the viral video. The digital wildfire was spreading faster than she could contain. But that felt distant compared to the immediate destruction happening across this small table. October 15th, 1993. I received intelligence about a planned IRA weapons transfer, car bombs, enough explosive to level half the neighborhood. My orders were to abort my cover operation immediately, extract to safe distance, and await the special branch raid at dawn. The memory came back with crystalline clarity, her handler's voice on the secure phone, curt and professional. No discussion of collateral damage, no mention of the family sleeping in houses that might not survive the night, just orders and extraction protocols and the cold mathematics of acceptable risk. "But the children," Sarah said. "The children." Margaret's voice broke completely now. "They were supposed to be safe. The raid was planned for empty buildings, abandoned warehouses. But intelligence was wrong, or incomplete, or—" She shook her head. 30 years of professional analysis crumbling into the simple truth. It doesn't matter why. What matters is that I knew. I knew there were families in those houses, and I had 20 minutes to choose between following orders and saving lives. The weight of that choice pressed down on her like Belfast rain, cold, persistent, inescapable. She'd carried it through every case since, every victory in court feeling hollow because it could never balance the scales of what she'd left behind. Sarah's phone was buzzing now too, social media notifications probably, friends sending her the video, asking if that was really her mother losing her mind outside Buckingham Palace. The viral storm was expanding, consuming everyone in Margaret's orbit. "You chose to save yourself," Sarah said quietly. "I chose to follow orders." The distinction felt meaningless now, a legal technicality in the face of moral catastrophe. I extracted to the safe house and told myself someone else would warn them, that it wasn't my responsibility, that I'd done enough just by loving them for a few stolen moments every week. Margaret's phone lit up with an incoming call from Richard again. She declined it automatically, muscle memory from years of controlling information flow. But control was an illusion now, had been an illusion since the moment Thomas McKenna put on that Royal Guard uniform and waited for her to find him. "Bridget died in the explosion," Margaret continued. "Not from the bombs, those were diffused successfully. She died because when the special branch raids began, when bullets started flying and houses caught fire, she ran outside looking for me, looking for her secret angel who'd promised that good things happened to children who were brave." The silence that followed felt absolute, as if the entire coffee shop had stopped breathing. Sarah's face had gone pale, her surgeon's composure finally cracking completely. "She was looking for you," Sarah repeated. "Thomas found her body in the street, still wearing her little silver cross, the one that matched mine." Margaret pulled the chain from her pocket, let it pool on the table between them like liquid guilt. He was 8 years old, and he held his dead sister in the rain while Belfast burned around them. And I was 5 miles away in a safe house, writing reports about successful intelligence operations and minimal collateral damage. Sarah stared at the cross, understanding finally settling over her like a shroud. The guard today. That was Thomas. 30 years later, still watching, still waiting. Margaret's phone buzzed again, and this time she didn't bother declining. The viral machine would feed whether she cooperated or not. "I think he's been planning this moment since the day I failed him." The coffee shop around them continued its oblivious rhythm, but their world had fundamentally shifted. Everything Sarah thought she knew about her mother lay in ruins, replaced by the terrible truth of choices made in darkness 30 years ago. "What does he want?" Sarah asked. Margaret looked at her daughter, brilliant, compassionate Sarah who still believed in justice and redemption, and realized she didn't know. Thomas had waited 3 decades for this moment, had orchestrated their meeting with the precision of someone who understood exactly how revenge worked. But revenge for what? Justice for Bridget? Acknowledgement of his loss? Or something darker, more complete? The kind of destruction that matched what he'd experienced that night in Belfast? Margaret's phone erupted with notifications again, the digital wildfire consuming everything she'd built since leaving Ireland behind. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I think we're about to find out." Outside, London traffic flowed past their window in endless streams, carrying tourists and locals through a city that had no idea it was witnessing the final act of a tragedy that began with a little girl's trust and ended with a mother's lies finally catching fire. The reckoning was accelerating now, 30 years of buried guilt exploding into public view with the viral velocity of justice, too long delayed. And somewhere across the city, Thomas McKenna was watching it all unfold exactly as he'd planned. Margaret's phone rang, cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. This time, she answered without looking at the caller ID. Margaret Whitmore. "Ms. Whitmore?" The voice was young, crisp, professional. "This is Emma Richardson from BBC News. We're preparing a segment about the viral video from Buckingham Palace today, and we'd like to give you an opportunity to comment before—" Margaret ended the call, but the damage was done. Sarah was staring at her with a particular expression she wore when diagnosing something terminal. "They don't know, do they?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "The journalists, the people sharing the video, they think this is just some entitled woman having a breakdown. That's what I hoped it would look like." Margaret's admission tasted like ash. Even when I saw him standing there, part of me thought maybe it was coincidence. Maybe I could play the part of an ordinary tourist having a bad day, and no one would ever connect. Her phone buzzed with a text message. This time, she looked. "Unknown number. You never did understand the game you were playing, did you? T." The coffee cup slipped from Margaret's fingers, ceramic shattering against the floor in a spray of cold coffee and broken porcelain. The crash drew stares from nearby tables, but Margaret barely noticed. She was reading the message again, each word a hammer blow against the carefully constructed lie she'd been telling herself. "Mum?" Sarah reached across the table. "What is it?" Margaret turned the phone so Sarah could see. The message sat there like a smoking gun, innocent black text that reframed 30 years of assumptions. "He knew," Margaret breathed. "He knew exactly who I was when I started walking past that house." The revelation hit like a physical blow. All those months of believing she was the predator, the trained intelligence officer manipulating innocent children for cover. All those years of guilt over allowing herself to care about them when she should have maintained professional distance. "I was never the one in control," Margaret continued, her voice hollow with understanding. "A 6-year-old boy and his 8-year-old sister didn't just randomly start following a stranger. Children don't work that way." Sarah's medical training kicked in, her analytical mind sorting through implications. Someone told them to. Someone told them you were safe to approach. The IRA had informants everywhere. Neighbors, shopkeepers, clergy, people who could identify British intelligence from a mile away. Margaret's hands were shaking now. "Thomas and Bridget didn't follow me because they were lonely. They followed me because someone wanted them to." Another text arrived. "You thought you were so clever, walking your little route with your little umbrella. Did you ever wonder why no one else seemed to notice the British spy playing dress-up in Cromwell Street?" The words rewrote everything. Margaret's careful tradecraft, her pride in maintaining deep cover, her belief that she'd successfully infiltrated Republican territory, all of it had been theater. She'd been allowed to operate because someone wanted her there. "They were using the children as bait," Sarah said, understanding dawning in her voice. "Someone was using those children to manipulate you." "The weapons transfer," Margaret whispered. "The intelligence that sent me running that night, it was never real, was it? It was designed to make me choose between my mission and 2 children who'd been told to trust me." Her phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a journalist. "Answer it," Sarah said quietly. Margaret accepted the call. No voice came through the speaker, but she could hear breathing, steady and patient. "Hello, Thomas. You're learning." His voice was exactly as she remembered, serious beyond his years, carrying weight that no child should bear. Though it took you long enough, you were 6 years old. Margaret's voice broke. How could a 6-year-old orchestrate? I wasn't the one pulling strings then. But children listen, Margaret. Children remember everything adults think they don't understand. His laugh held no warmth. I knew exactly what you were the first day you walked past our house. My uncle made sure of that. The uncle. Margaret's memory conjured fragments. A man who visited the McKenna house on Tuesdays and Fridays, always leaving just before she arrived. Someone she'd cataloged as extended family, harmless background noise. Seamus McKenna, she breathed. Provisional IRA, Belfast Brigade. The man who decided that turning a British intelligence officer into an unwitting double agent would be worth more than simply killing her. Thomas's voice carried 30 years of patient hatred. He told Bridget you were an angel, told her that angels sometimes needed children to help them find lost souls. The cruelty of it stole Margaret's breath. Not just the manipulation, but the perversion of a little girl's faith, turning her natural goodness into a weapon against the woman she'd learned to love. She died believing she was saving me, Margaret whispered. No. Thomas's voice cut like winter wind. She died believing you would save her. Even at the end, even when the bullets started flying, she kept calling for her secret angel. Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she understood the full scope of the betrayal. Not just Margaret's failure, but the calculated evil that had made that failure inevitable. You've spent 30 years believing you chose career over conscience, Thomas continued. But you never had a choice. The game was rigged from the beginning. The only question was whether you'd learn the truth before I destroyed everything you built on that lie. Outside the coffee shop, London continued its endless rhythm, oblivious to the reckoning unfolding in their corner booth. But Margaret finally understood. This had never been about justice for Bridget. This was about proving that even now, even after 30 years, she still didn't understand the game she'd lost.